And let's get started on the history of the Republican Party. So I left you with the argument that the Republican Party had a problem after the 1920s because it had set up the idea of American politics and government along the lines that finally, the Republicans were 100% in charge. And they had created this economy that was to die. I mean, I shouldn't say that, that was extraordinary. And it was in their minds bringing prosperity to everybody. And it was making it possible for people to stop even thinking about things like reform organizations because they wouldn't need reform organizations once everybody was rich, which it certainly looked like was finally going to happen. And one of the things I said, I'll be a little bit more off the cuff than usual today. One of the things that I find really interesting about doing the history of the 1920s and into the 1930s is that this is the last era in my mind where people operated, I hate to say in good faith, but remember that when the stuff I'm going to be talking about today, people did not know what a modern economy looked like. So when they're making arguments that we look back at nowadays and they look like they're being made in bad faith, I really don't think they are. I think this is the way they saw the world, and they saw it in very moralistic terms, and they didn't understand the forces they were dealing with. So, so I can read Herbert Hoover with a real sense of not sympathy, but I get where he's coming from, and the fact that he feels that the world has gone out of control. The reason I mention that is because I don't believe any longer after the 1940s and the understanding of modern economics, I don't believe that people are any longer arguing in good faith when they go back to these old arguments. And so doing the modern era, which I'm going to take up, of course, next week, you just feel dirty. I mean, when you read these guys making these arguments that they know are not true, that every piece of evidence says is not true, it's a really different feel for me than doing these older guys who, in retrospect, were wrong. But, how can you be right when the tools are not there to be right? All right, so that's the end of my speech on these guys right now. So I was talking about this extraordinary time in the 1920s, this heady prosperity, if you will, when, people were getting college educations in serious numbers for the first time, and people had refrigerators, and they had washing machines, which changed the dynamic in every household, and you could go to movies and see new films and read books and magazines that talked about the modern world and all these great new products you could have, the modern kitchen and irons and toasters and all these things that launched Americans into what looked like a world of extraordinary technology. And along with that, of course, the radio. And the radio is in the 1880s, people can only dream of a box that brings music and sound and plays into your home. We think about it nowadays. Look at this. I'm beaming at you from very rural Maine, and we're kind of accepting that. But think about trying to do this pandemic in an era without, for example, even a radio. I mean, how do you even? It's just such an extraordinary change that it really seems to a lot of Americans as if the world has become something new entirely. But that incredible change was not widespread. It really was limited to people who were near urban areas, not in what we would now consider cities, but near urban areas, and were somewhat upwardly mobile because you were seeing this new world in magazines. You were seeing this, and I always think about those of you who are boaters, the images in this period of Chris Crafts, these extraordinary boats, these just, well, if you've seen the movie on Golden Pond, when they hit the rock, I think it is, or something, and they break one of those boats, it's just like, I watched the movie once and could never watch it again because it's like, oh my God, one of those boats from the 1920s. But you're seeing these in magazines, and they're presented in such a way, again, using the technology that comes out of World War I and the propaganda machine of World War I. A lot of the people who worked for the government, the Committee on Public Education, the CPI went directly into advertising. Those things seem like they're within reach. and to a lot of people who have access to those magazines and access to radio and access to this whole new world. That access through the radio, through magazines, makes it seem to a lot of people as if it's real. And it's something that other people are getting. Maybe not you, but other people are. So you're going to have access to that as well. But that does not, in fact, extend especially to people in the West and to Western farmers, people who are in the plains, in Oklahoma and Nebraska and Texas and Kansas, places that have really opened up during World War I to feed the troops in Europe and to feed the troops, the American troops overseas. And what happens during World War I is farming prices get really high. And when that happens, people bring in a lot of marginal land that otherwise would not be productive. So as soon as the war is over and those contracts get canceled, people who have taken in that land are in trouble. They can, prices start to plummet. And as they do that, people start to think, well, if only I had better fertilizer, if only I had better machinery. And they go into debt to try and keep that production level up and try and keep more and more money coming in. And that, of course, is going to stress the plains especially extraordinarily. And I won't talk about it at all in this series, but this is one of the roots of the Dust Bowl, is that attempt to bring in all this land and to get rid of the native grasses that anchor the soil and replace them with agricultural crops. But for our purposes today, the prices of commodities, of Western especially, but of farming commodities, plummets. And it plummets both because of the end of the war and because of the pandemic of 1918, because it wipes out so many people worldwide, between 20 and 40 million people, we think. It creates a less of a demand for agricultural products, and that, of course, helps prices to continue going down, so that by 1929, for example, even though there's been some rebounding of agricultural products after the war, they still are not at the same levels they were at the end of World War I. So farmers are hurting, and what they do is they go to their Congress people and they say, help us out here, do something. And Congress tries to go ahead and pass some laws propping up agricultural prices, and Coolidge vetoes them. President Coolidge, a Republican, vetoes them because he says this is not a good idea. This creates a paternalistic government, as he said, and what really needs to happen is that farmers need to find better ways to market their crops. Well, there's no point in marketing your crops better when in fact there's no one to buy them. But there is this disjunction in this period, and I find this really interesting culturally. And this is coming not from me, but from scholars of cosmetics and of social life. Some of you who live in the South and West, I used to live in Oklahoma, have noted that women in those parts of the country will not go out in public unless they look terrific. They're well dressed, they're made up, their hair looks great, unlike people like me in Maine who rolled out of bed and doing this. And the cultural speculation is that really comes on after this period, in the 1950s, really, with the advent of cosmetics and they've been around before, and air conditioning. But what they're really trying to symbolize is that with the new prosperity that comes after World War II, women in the South and West no longer have to live literally in the dirt as they were in the period before World War II. And, I'm not a scholar of that stuff, so I can only rely on other people's work, but I find it really interesting that there is this cultural difference between especially white women in the West and the South and white women elsewhere who are maybe less concerned about their outside appearance. And the tying of that to the conditions in the West during the 1930s, I think, is a really interesting one, although I'm not willing necessarily to take it to the bank because it's not, as I say, it's not my field of study, but I thought it might interest some of you guys. All right. Farmers don't really enjoy this kind the access to this new era, but even more significantly, people of color, especially Black Americans, don't enjoy access to this vibrant 1920s. Beginning in 1889, with the Harrison administration really trying to force the idea of African American voting back onto the national agenda, what happens is you start to see a real resurgence of lynching in America. So there'd been a big period of lynching in the of African Americans. There are periods of lynching of other people in America, but I'm going to be talking right now about African Americans. So there is this big push for lynching with the KKK in the 1870s, really from 1868 to about 1871, 1872. And then actually African American lynching falls in a bit of a lull. It's picked up in the West by Mexican American lynching, but there is a period when it looks as if African American lynching, the numbers are dropping. The terrorism is still there. That's a little bit of a different story. And the idea of that lynching from the 1870s carries on, so people are afraid it's going to happen again. But there is a bit of a lull until 1889. And with 1889, white lynching of African Americans goes off the charts. And one of the reasons that I really like to emphasize this is because people sometimes put together the KKK and this new period of lynching. But there's a real important difference. And the first is that in the period of the 1870s, when the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, is out assassinating African Americans and sometimes white politicians who work with them or white voters who work with them, they're covering their faces. They know that they should not be seen. In the period from 1889 forward, the KKK and white vigilante groups are not hiding their faces at all. In fact, to the contrary, they're taking pictures of themselves in places where they're killing their black neighbors. And that shows a real difference in societal expectations and with the idea of what it really means to be a good American. And I think that's really important, that change from we know we shouldn't be doing this and the federal government's going to come down on us if we do, and we are so proud of what we're doing, we're going to hold a picnic here, which is mind-boggling. But I think you can kind of see how a society gets there if you look around yourself today. All right, so what happens is that the racial tensions that take off after 1889 and 1890, with the language suggesting that African Americans should not vote because they are voting for goodies, if you will, they're voting for redistribution of wealth, that transforms by the end of the 1890s into a general social attack on Black participation in society, especially Black male participation in society, that links not only to the political issue, but also to the historical trope of African American men as rapists, and the idea that they are literally going to use political power to create social power that is going to create all the negative, vicious stereotypes you've heard of. That we have to acknowledge, but I hate to even talk that much about them because I hate to give anybody the chance to have a clip of me seeming to in any way. I don't like to be associated with those words, but you all know, or if you don't, you should know the tropes that I'm talking about. And that really begins to take over American society beginning in 1889, but really taking off after that. And World War I exacerbates this in a really big way. And I talked a little bit about this because of the need to fill positions in factories. African Americans begin to move out of the South and into Western and Northern cities. And with that, racial tensions are spread across the country. So about 2 million African Americans leave the South in what's known as the Great Migration and move to northern cities. And quickly, they run into racial animosity from the white people into whose neighborhoods they move, usually without adequate housing, by the way, because there isn't adequate housing in these cities that are supplying the war effort. And after the war, we get, of course, what's known as the Red Summer. And I talked a bit about the Red Summer and both the fear of communism coming from Europe, but also the fear of African Americans embracing this sort of redistribution of wealth with which they have become associated since 1871, and the race riots across the country and the racial massacres across the country are astonishing. I mean, just astonishing. So most notably, there is a riot and a riot does not, to my mind, imply that both sides are fighting. The riot in Chicago is what I'm going to talk about in summer of 1919. That happened when a young African-American boy was swimming and moved. He floated toward the white section of the beach, and white boys threw rocks at him, knocked him out, and he drowned. In the aftermath of that Chicago riot, 38 people died and 500 were wounded. And then, of course, there were across the country similar riots, leaving African Americans dead. And this is, I'm talking politically here, but this is something that I love and don't ever get a chance to talk about. And I told you I might be a little bit all over the map today. So one of the things this sparks, of course, is an extraordinary outpouring of African-American literature. Some of our finest African-American literature comes out of this time, including poetry. And for me to be talking about how brilliant poetry is, let me tell you, a stretch. My favorite poem in American history literature is, of course, by an African-American man. I'm not going to, by Dudley Randall. I'm not going to recite that now because it doesn't really fit what I'm talking about today. But what does is the incredibly famous lines from Claude McKay, who is an African-American poet. And he said, he wrote, "If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die." And that feeling of, we're Americans and we're going to take this country back for democracy, I think is written all over what becomes known as the Harlem Renaissance, which is an upswelling of African-American culture across the country. It is, of course, centered in Harlem, which has its own incredible history, but it's not exclusive to Harlem. We have the rise of blues in Chicago, notably Jelly Roll Morton, one of the just absolutely brilliant, off the charts, brilliant pianists. But also novelists like Jean Toomer, for example, who wrote the novel about his upbringing in the South called Cain, and the real rise in America in popular culture of jazz, which comes out of New Orleans and of course comes up the Mississippi River. So what this does is it changes the entire relationship in America of racial issues, because the race struggles in America until this period had been identified in popular culture really as a Southern problem. Now that was always a misnomer, because of course African Americans have always been all over this country, but more to the heart of that point, I think, is that a race issue in America has not only been about African Americans. It gets defined that way, especially after the Civil War. But of course, there have always been tensions with Euro-Americans and indigenous peoples and Chinese Americans and the island peoples who begin to come to America in the middle of the 19th century. And of course, always with Mexicans and Mexican Americans. So this idea of it being a Southern problem was a Southern problem, that's in quotations. It's always been a misnomer, but in this period, that misnomer goes out the window, because it's pretty clear now that African American white tensions are going to be across all of America. And that's going to change everything, because what it's going to do is it's going to force both political parties really to grapple with what is at heart a national issue about the relationship between democracy and race. All right, so one of the things that happens is, as I say, lynching continues in the 1920s and goes forward. I'm not going to talk a lot more about lynching now, because that would lead me down a rabbit hole. But it also gives rise to the idea of white Americans, Euro-Americans, needing to protect traditional America from outside influences. And so in the 1920s, we're going to get the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan. Taking the same name, of course, as the first Ku Klux Klan, but really interestingly, standing as much against immigrants as it does against African Americans, and also standing against Jews and Catholics in the liquor industry. which is really interesting. The idea of these foreign peoples coming to challenge traditional America. And the heart of the KKK in the 1920s is in Indiana. And that itself is a really interesting story that I think I know the answer to, but I don't have time to go into it right now because I haven't even gotten up to the crash. But I just love the 1920s for its literature and all the social forces that are at work there. So the Klan is at work in the 1920s, and I can't tell you more about the Klan either, frustrating though that is. But remember, the Klan is going to hold picnics. Picnics. They're going to have marches in Washington with their faces uncovered. Where they talk about taking back traditional Americans. And one of the things that they do is they manage to convince the Republican Party that they need to jettison their support for African American rights. That had been waning really since 1889 when Harrison tried to shore up black voting, although it was a really instrumental thing for him. But the Republican Party has been backing away from black rights for a while. And so, for example, when Hoover sent the Gold Star mothers, and a Gold Star mother is somebody who has lost a child in the service, of course in this era it would have been men, to Europe to visit their sons' graves from World War I, he segregated the boats, And similarly, when he took the 10th Cavalry, which was like the most celebrated army unit of African American soldiers, and he disbanded it and he put them all into menial jobs. And when a group of African Americans came to visit him at the White House, he refused to let them in. He actually met them on the lawn. So it was pretty clear that the Republican Party is backing away from black rights in this period. But they're also backing away from support for immigration. And so you are going to see for example, in 1924, a new very, very famous immigration act called the 1924 Immigration Act, which dramatically lowers the quotas for immigrants coming into America and designs country quotas so that certain countries get to have different numbers of people coming in. That's going to be overturned in the 1960s, and someday maybe I will talk about immigration law in this country, because the 1960s law is a really interesting thing, and it's the reason that we have all the problems we have today with immigration being used as a political football. There was a major error in that legislation in the 60s, bipartisan legislation, by the way. It was a bit of a I won't say an oversight, but it's very easy to fix. It's just that now there's no political will to do it. Anyway, immigration restriction begins again to turn Americans against the idea of an other. This is when we get really, scientists really digging in on the idea that some ethnic groups are better than others. And we also get the eugenics movement really taking hold. So in 1927, for example, in the Buck versus Bell Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court approved the government policy of sterilizing people that the government thought would produce undesirable children. During the course of the 20th century, that is going to result in the government sterilizing about 60,000 people. And I hope you're sitting down, because this program extended into the 1970s. The 1970s against Indigenous women. There are women alive today who were sterilized against their will by the federal government, which is, I won't say anymore. All right. So this, of course, is also symbolized in August of 1927 when we get the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti in Boston, those immigrants that I talked about before, who probably were somehow related to the murder of a paymaster in Braintree, Massachusetts, but who became the symbol of this white supremacist government coming down on people of color and immigrants. And again, a little bit more of literature. John Dos Passos, who is one of our most powerful writers, one of 3 books I was not able to finish in my lifetime because it was simply too powerful. The other 2 I didn't finish because they made me mad. But I didn't finish John Dos Passos' 3 Soldiers because it just was too much for me at the time, and I recognized that I was too young to really to handle that book. Anyway, John Dos Passos wrote after the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti, "They have clubbed us off the streets. They are stronger. They are rich. They hire and fire. the politicians, the newspaper editors, the old judges, the small men with reputations, the college presidents, the ward healers. Listen, businessmen, college presidents, judges, America will not forget her betrayers. They hire the men with guns, the uniforms, the police cars, the patrol wagons. We stand defeated, America. If you were living in the 1920s and looking at your magazines with those glossy photos and those new kitchens, you listened to people like John Dos Passos and said they were just that underbelly of the country who never was grateful for anything, right? But, there's always a but coming with me. All right. People dismissed, Claude McKay and John Dos Passos as those radical outliers. But the truth was that there was a desperate bubble going on. So in the 1920s, late 1920s, this faith in America and in all these new technologies have people pouring money into the stock market, and people are speculating in it. So that, for example, prices that seem crazy low in the spring of 1929, a crazy high in 1929, are crazy low by the fall. So radio, for example, I have some statistics here, was at 94.5 in March. By November, it was 101, but it had split so often that March's holdings were actually worth 505. And that was the case across the ticker tape. The ticker tape, by the way, for those of you who are younger, is a piece of paper that ticks out information. So it's literally a tape coming out of a machine where you can read what's happening on the stock market. It's literally a piece of paper, a tape. But everybody wants into this. Everybody wants into this this new booming economy, money to be made quick, right? The same way we saw in the housing boom in the early 2000s. And money pours into the stock market. And as I talked about last week, people begin buying on margin. And at the same time, Andrew Mellon is pumping money into the economy by cutting taxes to the wealthy and by giving rebates to people of previously paid taxes. So he pumped about $3.5 billion back into the economy with rebates. So we also had the problem of the fact that bankers and savings institutions were the same. So bankers also start to throw money into the economy and into the stock market. And anybody who was sort of saying, oh, wait, we got a problem here, gets dismissed as being anti-American. That they are people who don't have faith in this new somebody just asked why I emphasize Jelly Roll Morton. The truth is because he is my son is an extraordinary piano player, obviously not a professional. Jelly Roll Morton's his favorite. So I actually have done a lot of research on him just because of my son. So yes, he's associated with New Orleans, but he does come up to Chicago, and he's one of the greats that everybody should know. So that's why I emphasize him so much, even though he is more associated with New Orleans. Anyway, all right. So anybody who is saying we got a problem here is dismissed as being a downer, somebody who we shouldn't be paying attention to. And of course, but Hoover knows there's a problem. Hoover's worried. And on October 24th, and crashes usually happen in October, by the way. There's some philosophical reasons for that, but I always am nervous about Octobers myself. Think about it. The October crash of 87, which was actually a really big deal in terms of financial markets, 1987. Anyway, October 24th, stocks begin to drop. And what happens first is that as they start to drop, brokers get afraid they're going to get caught, and they dump their stocks, more and more of their stocks. And that ticker tape that I was talking about starts to run behind. So nobody knows how much is going down. And people dump and dump and dump at lower and lower prices. And by the afternoon, there's a rally. And actually the day ends not that far down from where it started, but all the little players got wiped out in the morning. It became known as the slaughter of the innocents. But then after this happened, this Thursday, on Friday, a lot of people are like, hey, wait, now we look at all the stuff we can pick up cheaply. So people rush back into the stock market. And then it looks like Friday and Saturday, the stock market might be okay. And then it opens on Monday and things are wavering. It's not clear. And then the crash hits on Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday. It went down in history as that. it was just a massive sell-off. As people used to say, if the first crash took out the innocents, the Black Tuesday took out everybody else. So that first crash might have been acceptable for the Republicans as a market correction. They often say, well, if the stocks are dropping, it's a market correction, it's fine. But that doesn't explain the depression. And it's really the depression that follows the crash that undermines the concept that the Republicans were pushing of the idea that their form of wedding of the economy and politics, a wedding of businessmen and politics, is going to mean prosperity for everybody, because they can't offer any kind of a formula for getting out of the depression, because their ideology was precisely what led to the depression. So they can't pivot midway, and not simply because people won't buy it, but because they really don't have an ideological alternative. Their idea was that if you put businessmen in charge of the government, they would create extraordinary prosperity and everybody would do great. And it looked like it worked. And they said, we own this. This is ours. The Democrats don't know what they're doing. Look at what we have built. And then the entire thing falls apart. They can't then go, oopsie poopsie, we shouldn't have done that. They don't have an ideological direction to turn. So what they do is that they first of all begin to say nothing is wrong here, and it's actually true in a way. The actual number of people speculating in the stock markets was probably less than 1.5 million people out of a population of 120 million. So what was the problem? The problem was that worker productivity had increased by about 43% during the 1920s, but worker wages had not risen at all. All of those profits went to people at the top, and when the crash happened, the middling people and the people at the bottom who lost their jobs simply did not have the buying power to keep the economy going. I mean, cars are rolling off the assembly lines, but there's nobody who's got the cash to buy them, except for the people who already have them. So there's nothing to prime the pump, as people say, of the economy to get things going back forward. In 1929, about 5% of the population had received about 1/3 of the nation's income, and they simply couldn't keep the economy going. At the same time, that push during the 1920s to tie together all of the major chains that I mentioned, all the major department stores, for example, and all the banks, creates a domino effect. When one goes, now they all go, because there weren't walls enough to preserve different pockets of the economy. They all went at the same time. So the numbers were appalling. I mean, prices just dropped out of the bottom, dropped off the charts. So, for example, by 1932, America was producing less pig iron than it was in 1896. Foreign trade dropped, and agricultural prices just plummeted. Wheat went from $1.05 a bushel to 39 cents a bushel. In fact, it was people were burning their crops because it was cheaper to get rid of them than it was to try and get them to market. And the economy, the unemployment goes off the charts. By 1932, 1 million people in New York City didn't have work, and people began to live in packing boxes on the outskirts of towns, and these become known as Hoovervilles. And I've written about this some. Anyway, so what the Republican Party does is, what are they going to do? How are they going to take care of this? And Andrew Mellon, who's the Secretary of the Treasury, and I'm exaggerating here, is 400 years old. I mean, look at pictures of him. He totally looks like a cadaver. Anyway, he is like, well, screw them. This is a good thing because, and this is literally a quote from him, liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. This is a conversation he has with Hoover. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up the wrecks from less competent people. And he, his belief is this is a moral failing of working Americans. It's not a problem with people at the top. It's that workers are immoral. They're not pulling their own weight. Let me add an addendum here. This is dead wrong. Okay, right. This is dead wrong. And Hoover looks at this, and he believes in the same philosophy of government that Mellon does. But Hoover got his start, his famous start, if you will, by feeding the people of Belgium during World War I. And he did not want Americans starving on his watch. And he knew, as Mellon did not, that it was no longer feasible for people to go back home the way it was in the Panic of 1873, for example, which Mellon remembered, as far as I know. He knew that you couldn't do that any longer. So I'm sorry, 1893, not 73, but in 93 it was still possible to go home. It wasn't really. People had moved around because of the war. And so Hoover doesn't really want to do that, but he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't want to create any kind of a social welfare system because he thinks that that's going to destroy American individualism. And so he kind of limps along trying to do various things and tries to emphasize that people are responsible for their own futures. They need to work harder, which most Americans adhere to. They are fully on board with that, but they can't because the economy has fallen apart. So they want desperately to work, but there's nowhere actually to do that. And so as the economy collapses, people start to look more and more at what's happened with bankers and with their stocks. And they discover that for all their talk about how great everything was doing, a lot of the people on the stock market were cheating. And again, usually when there's an economic downturn and people start to look around for their money, they're like, hey, wait a minute. And they discover people have been embezzling. The head of the stock market has been speculating with other people's money. A guy named Richard Whitney, who's going to come back in just a minute, has been embezzling. And, it's like, wait a minute, you're telling us we're not moral and you've been screwing around and taking all our money? People are not happy. So Hoover continues to talk about thrift and working hard, but it just doesn't work. And in 1932, of course, the Republicans lose to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat from New York, who's like, we need a new deal. Workers need a new deal. And that's where we get the name the New Deal, of course. So FDR goes into office and he dramatically changes the federal government. He puts in place what's known as an alphabet soup of programs, everything from the CCC, one of my favorite, the Civilian Conservation Corps, one of my favorite programs in American history because it's brilliant, of course, because it takes young men out of the cities in the summer. You never want young men unemployed in the cities in the summer, and moves them to the middle of freaking nowhere and gives them hard work all day and gives them a paycheck. So it's a win-win for everybody. Young men get paychecks, they can send home to their families, and they're isolated from the city so they can't start riots, and they actually build tree breaks and take care of the land that's been so badly damaged out in the West. But everybody looks at the CCC and they're like, oh, isn't that such a great program? It was so good of him to do that for the poor. Yes, but it also pulls rioters out of the city. I mean, FDR was no idiot. But his programs provide, they employ more than 8.5 million people. They put them in charge of about 1.4 million individual products. They build more than 650,000 miles of highways. They build or repair 120,000 bridges. They build more than 125,000 public buildings. They paint murals in rural post offices to bring art to the masses, if you will. They collect oral histories. They write state histories. They provide $500 million directly to states for work relief. And they distribute surplus farm products to people in need. So that you get this entire change in the American system. We also are going to try and shore up the weaknesses of the Republican system. We're going to get limits on what bankers can do. We're going to get the Securities and Exchange Commission to try and make sure that what happens in the stock market is on a level playing field. And that's pushed, incidentally, not by poor people, but by actual traders who recognize that they can't start new companies if you have to know the right people and pay off the right people. They know that new people coming into the market know that they can't get there. They can't get anywhere if the system is rigged, and they want to make sure somebody stands in to make sure the system is not rigged by people like Richard Whitney. And we get the Glass-Steagall Act, which separates savings and investment banks. And we increasingly get protections for workers. For example, the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, which gives the workers the right to organize and to bargain collectively with their employers. And there's also a new National Labor Relations Board at the national level to protect workers. We also get the creation of a social safety net. We get the Social Security Act. which is the brainchild of a woman named Frances Perkins, who sits in the Department of Labor, the Secretary of the Department of Labor, Secretary of Labor. She's a fascinating woman, and she puts in place the Social Security Act, but also unemployment insurance, and puts regulations around child labor, again with the idea that the government needs to help people at the bottom. It needs to regulate business, it needs to provide a basic social safety net, and it needs to promote infrastructure. And that is what I keep talking about when I refer to the New Deal government. It's a complete change in the way Americans think about government. Well, while this is going on, Republicans are aghast at what they see as the destruction of America by this construction of this New Deal state. They say that America is becoming is being taken over by class warfare, that that the Democrats have launched a war on people with money, and that this is going to destroy America. And in 19 drawing a blank. 1936. Is it 1936? 1936. Darn it. Oh, well, 32, 36. Yeah, of course. FDR 36. Somebody check me because I'm tired. The Republicans nominate Alf Landon, if you've heard of Alf Landon, and he basically says, we got to go back to the way things were. You guys are all socialists and communists, and you're changing America. And it doesn't work. Landon only gets about 36% of the vote, and FDR gets more than 60. I mean, Americans like this New Deal. So increasingly, there is concern in America that this attempt to that America is going to go full out fascist, and people are very concerned about the rise of fascism in America, because of course you have the rise of fascism across the world, really coming out of Italy with Mussolini and his concept of a new way to move his society forward, with the idea that some people are better than others, and that logically means that one person is the best, and that one person should organize everybody else and should move the workers of the country, those people who don't think as well, together by militarizing them and by making them fiercely nationalistic, and by brutally suppressing any kind of dissent. And it looks like that might happen in America in this period. And you see it with the rise of people like Father Coughlin, who is a radio priest who gets more and more people behind him, and people like Huey Long in Louisiana, Governor Huey Long, who manages to get a lot of people behind him, first governor and then senator, to get a lot of people behind him with the idea of one person at the head of the government. And people are really concerned about it, enough that Sinclair Lewis in 1935 writes a book called It Can't Happen Here, and it's a reflection on how fascism would come to America. And he is famous for saying that when fascism came to America, it would come wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross. And I mention this here simply because it was not Sinclair Lewis who said that. It was actually a minister, a professor at Yale, a guy named Halford Lucknock, who gave a speech in 1938 that said that, and that he had said that repeatedly, and that fascism in America would come called Americanism. And he said, quote, "The high-sounding phrase, the American way, will be used by interested groups intent on profit to cover a multitude of sins against the American and Christian tradition, such sins as lawless violence, tear gas and shotguns, denial of civil liberties." Anyway. Republicans continued, though, to be less concerned about fascism than they were about communism, and they insisted that FDR was transforming America into a communist country or into a socialist country. And that's really exacerbated for them by the fact that FDR begins to attract African American voters. And I'm going to talk later about the Southern strategy, and the Southern strategy is of course, extraordinarily important. But the real break of African Americans from the Republican Party begins in the 1920s, but takes off in the 1930s under the New Deal. And I've talked a lot about how the New Deal preserves racial hierarchies in America, and that's a really important story. It's also an important story that for African Americans, it's still a better deal than what the Republicans are offering at the time. And because New Deal problems disproportionately helped people in the bottom third of American society, that meant they helped African Americans, and that they were not fair. The Social Security, for example, excludes domestic workers and field work, which of course is overwhelmingly African American in the South, and it allowed white employers in the South to basically take the money that was intended for African Americans. There's all kinds of horrible loopholes. But the reason that I'm mentioning it today and not really talking more about that is because it's the moment in which African Americans decide to gamble on the Democrats. And FDR welcomes this. And the reason that FDR welcomes this is a long, fascinating, and complicated story that I actually am working on right now for what maybe a new book. So I'm not going to go into it now, but you can learn more about it in the future if you are interested. But FDR made it a point to welcome African American voters. He and Eleanor both, his wife Eleanor both, reached out to African Americans when in 1936 the Republicans tried to embarrass FDR and Eleanor by circulating a picture of Mrs. Roosevelt standing with African American ROTC cadets, and sort of tried to make a deal out of it. She just said, "I'm proud of it. Go ahead, make all the deal you want. I'm perfectly fine to be associating with Americans regardless of race, color, or creed," as she said. And she, of course, is going to be the person who guarantees Marian Anderson a place to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when the Daughters of the American Revolution don't let her go into Constitution Hall to sing there. Marian Anderson being one of the world's most celebrated opera singers at the time. And she was not allowed in because she was African American into the Constitution Hall. So Eleanor gets her permission to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and that's known in American history as our first civil rights, major, national, popular civil rights protest. Marian Anderson was present when Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, something I always liked, a connection I always liked. All right, so what happens here? The Republican Party, which is after all why we're here. I'm going to go on for about 10 more minutes. I got caught up in literature there. Sorry about that. So what happens here? The Republican Party is a real problem, like I say. Does it go with the Hoover thing and say this all is miserable and we need to get rid of it? Or does it accept this extraordinarily popular New Deal government, this new, what is going to become known as a liberal consensus? The party splits. And this split is still with us today. It is still changing American politics today. So pay attention to this split. What happens is the people who hate the New Deal beyond all else are led by a guy named Robert Taft from Ohio. He's President William Howard Taft's son, and he worked for Hoover, and he believes that this New Deal is a deal with the devil. He wants absolutely no part of it. And when Alf Landon goes down in flames in 1936, the next year, Robert Taft really comes to the fore as the leader of the new anti-New Deal Republicans. And they really believe they are the only Republicans, that anybody else is simply a watered-down Democrat. And they begin to work with the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, who don't like the idea of African-American rights. They're already running around being very vocal by the 1930s because they don't like what FDR's New Deal is permitting in terms of pay for African Americans and rights for African Americans, because FDR is going during the war to enforce desegregation in factories that have government contracts, and this they think is anathema. So the Taft Republicans begin to talk to the Southern Dixiecrats, the Southern recalcitrant Southern Democrats. But there's a big branch of the Republican Party is like, it's clear that the 1920s didn't work. We need to embrace these new ideas. And they are led by a Republican from New York, a guy named Thomas E. Dewey. And Thomas Dewey accepts the concept of the New Deal, although he thinks Republicans will do it a lot better. And he doesn't like the attitude of the Democrats. He says the Democrats are all negative about everything. I'm going to be positive about stuff. And he's gotten famous because he's the guy who prosecuted the case against the head of the stock exchange who was embezzling, Richard Whitney, that I was just telling you about. I have said before that there's only 6 people in U.S. history, and they do the rest with mirrors, and this is a great example of that. Anyway, so there's this fight in the Republican Party between the Taft wing and the Dewey wing. And, okay, so how does this play out? Who wins and why? Well, the Taft people are isolationists, and they see the rise of World War II in Europe, and they're like, it's none of our problem. We don't want anything to do with it. The Dewey wing of the party says, we got ourselves a problem. We better do something over there. And when the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Dewey's star absolutely rises because obviously in the Republican Party, obviously this Democrats in charge, the Republican Party's out of power right now, but because he called it right. They called it right. And this is when the Taft wing says that FDR knew and let it happen because he wanted to drag us into war. That is propaganda from the Dewey wing. FDR did not know that attack was coming on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. He knew an attack was coming. Everybody knew an attack was coming, but nobody knew where. And they put people on high alert, but nobody knew where it was coming. The idea that he knew and let it happen is the disgruntled Taft wing angry because they were wrong when they said America did not have to get involved in this war. So what happens with this? What happens is that by 1940, the Dewey wing is more powerful than the Taft wing in the Republican Party, and they are able to nominate Wendell Willkie for president. And this is extraordinarily irresponsible because Willkie had never even held elective office, and everybody knew a war was on the horizon. But Willkie, of course, loses. And the president, FDR, wins re-election with more than 55% of the popular vote, less than he had before, but more than but certainly a great deal more than Willkie, who got 45. So you can see the star rising of the Dewey Republicans. So where do you go from here? The Republican Party has this split in it, and it's clear that the Dewey people have the upper hand. And you can see this really dramatically in 1944 and 1945, when the Republicans really push a new piece of legislation that is known, that the Democrats help with, but it's really a Republican piece of legislation at first. And that's the one that's known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill. And the Democrats want that law because they're afraid of the return of a depression. So they actually they fill it up with things to help people get out of a depression. The Republicans look at it and say, no, we want it to boom opportunity. And when they pass it with both of those things in it, and GIs, general infantry, start coming home and don't face unemployment at all because the economy is booming, the unemployment stuff kind of falls away, and we get the GI Bill. And I mention that because the GI Bill is one of the most important things in American history. The first GI Bill passes in 43, and it's going to be changed again in 45 to reflect the changes I just talked about. But the GI Bill completely changes the American economy. It helps 4 million veterans build homes. And then, of course, house construction pumps up the building trades. Lots of people get married because they've been putting off marriages during the Depression and sort of to make up for the deaths of World War II. So you get tons of new marriages, and then the baby boom. And, these children move into these new homes, and they buy all the new products that are on the market, the bikes and the diapers and the furniture and the televisions and the pencils and the backpacks. And I guess you didn't have backpacks, and the lunch boxes, all of that stuff. And here's a little tidbit for you guys. in the book I wrote about the Republican Party, I talk about a baby card, a commercially produced baby card that reads, "Wonderful news for the diaper service, greeting card publishers, toy shops, orthodontists, infants wear department, carriage makers, milkman, supermarket, pediatricians, furniture manufacturers, shoe salesmen, department stores. P.S. Also good for income tax deductions. Congratulations on the new baby." And if you actually looked at the footnote, you will see it's in the Richardson family collection. That's my baby card. And it was just too good not to put in there. So there, you know the secret now behind where that baby card came from. But the GI Bill also offered training to people who otherwise wouldn't have gotten it. So 51% of veterans, 7.8 million of them, went back to school. Those were largely white men. African Americans and women were eligible. My mother went back for a master's degree on the GI Bill after being a WAC during World War II. But mostly those benefits went to white men. There were so many people who went back to colleges that colleges and universities had to build temporary housing. And these new mature students, as they called them, were serious. They were smart. They were hardworking. And the GI Bill produced 450,000 American engineers, 180,000 medical professionals, 360,000 teachers, 150,000 scientists, 243 accountants, 107,000 lawyers, 36,000 clergymen. What you see here is the construction of the post-war middle class. And as that post-war middle class moved up, it also created a vacuum below from the trades that these people would otherwise have been in. And into those positions went people with less skill. So this is really what is fueling the post-World War II economic boom. All right, so what happens? The war ends. Actually, even before the war ends, FDR has a massive cerebral hemorrhage on April 12th, 1945. There's a reason I remember that date. And the war is going to end after the bombing of Pearl Harbor later on, when Truman bombs Pearl Harbor later on. I usually like to use agency when I talk about history. Then, of course, we get thrown into a recession, a post-war recession, as usually happens after a war. There's a long story about that as well. And with that, the Republicans sweep the midterm elections of 1946. FDR is finally gone, as far as they're concerned. Here's their big chance. Truman's a fascinating character in a lot of ways. Really interesting character. And I don't know, but he's not perceived as well at the time as he is in retrospect for a variety of reasons. Let's put it that way. But so his popularity is at an all-time low, and the Republicans sweep the midterm elections of 1946, and they really, really, really think they're going to get rid of the New Deal. They really think that they're going to sweep the New Deal out of existence. It was this crazy moment in American history when communists had taken over the government, and they're going to get rid of it. And Robert Taft, who's the senator from Ohio and really the de facto chair of the Republican Party, he controls some money even though he's not the chair of the Republican National Committee. He really thinks his star is rising and he's going to be winning. Taft begins in 1947, now he's got control of Congress, to work with the Southern Democrats who don't want black rights, to block anything that the Democrats do. This is when Truman starts to talk about a do-nothing Congress. And in order to undercut the Republicans' emphasis on communism in America, the Democrats really beef up the House Un-American Activities Committee beginning immediately after the war. And then the Republicans take it over, and they're going to be digging into the idea that communism is spreading in America through Hollywood. And this is why we're going to get those first HUAC investigations into communism in Hollywood. Over Truman's veto, Taft's people slashed taxes. They cut income taxes, they cut estate taxes, and they go ahead and, with the Taft-Hartley Act, rein in the ability of workers to bargain collectively. And similarly, the Republicans believe that they're going to be able to take over the country in 1948, that they're absolutely going to win. And they believe they're going to do so both because the popular will is behind them, but also because of a structural issue in the Democratic Party. As the Democrats have begun to embrace African American rights, The Dixiecrats, led by Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, have peeled away and are forming their own party called Dixiecrats. And those Dixiecrats stand for segregation, and they're mad at the Democratic Party for waffling on that issue. And so convinced were the Republicans that they were going to win that the Chicago Tribune, which is staunchly Republican in this period, that whole chain of newspapers led by the Chicago Tribune that's when they print the newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman. You've seen that picture of Truman holding that up. They were so convinced that Dewey was going to win in 48 that they actually pre-printed their newspapers. And of course they were wrong. Truman was reelected in 1948 because people ultimately liked the New Deal. They liked the New Deal reforms, especially those that were protecting workers, and they did not want to get rid of them. And the vote was not even particularly close. Truman got about 49.5% of the vote, and Dewey only got 45.1%. The Dixiecrats took about 2.4% and got more than 1 million votes in the Deep South. It's clear that the Republican attempt to destroy the New Deal under Taft is not a winner in 1948. And the rest of American political history has been the attempt of those anti-New Deal people, this rump group of the American political system who hated the New Deal, to get rid of it, to dial back those reforms and take us back to the governmental system that was in place during the 1920s, in that classic moment of republicanism, that great moment of republicanism in their minds, when the stock market boomed and it seemed that prosperity, at least on paper, was going to everyone. All right, I actually brought that in at 49 minutes. I'm sorry, 59 minutes. I can do history, but not math. Thank you for being here. Sorry I'm a little discombobulated. And I will be back next week. And obviously now, with the rise of Eisenhower next week, we're getting into what's happening today. So I hope you've been with me on this story, which is an epic story about the clash between property and equality in America, and how that's played out through our political system, but especially within the Republican Party. The history is fabulous and great, but looking forward, it's not only interesting and important, it also says an awful lot about today. All right, thank you guys. I'll see you next week.